postmodern deconstruction. Okay, the crisis of modernity. If we spent the last lecture kind of defining what postmodernism is, I just want to review a little bit how it sort of came into place. Early 20th century, remember, right up to 1900, everybody was feeling pretty good about how much progress we were making, and everything was going so well, and we were solving all the problems and helping all the poor native populations in those backward cultures across the globe. Okay, so the 20th century dawns. Well, maybe not so much. World wars, 2 of them in a row. It's actually one world war with a big intermission in the middle. That's World War I and World War II. 80 million dead, Auschwitz, Hiroshima. And in the middle, during the intermission, we get a global economic collapse, devastated the economies of, at least 3/4 of the countries on the planet. Didn't get out of it until the end of World War II. Interesting thing, you see a real rise of credit during this time. Nobody had really developed credit as a way to own a house or a car until we had to in the middle of the Depression, because nobody had any money. So people would say, well, you bring in $10 a month and you can drive my Model T home. And that was the beginning of credit. You also had a lot of social upheaval as a result of all of these things. Here's Albert coming up with the relativity theory, so we're still thinking, we're still figuring things out. And look, we've got TV now, which just was a giant brain suck. This heralded the advent of advertising. We'll talk about that in a minute, but this is the period of time in which Brave New World, Animal Farm, 1984, and Fahrenheit 451 all kind of came into appearance. These are all novels, speculative novels, science fiction, if you will, that talk about what the world is going to look like. And boy, when 1984 rolled around, not too long ago, had a lot of buzz about this, how close we've come. These guys were largely prophetic. If you had to read one of them, I'd recommend 1984, but Brave New World and Animal Farm, gosh. And you'll hear it referred to everywhere you go for the rest of your life. You should know it. Sarah?
And none of these books are like huge reads either.
No. No, 2 hours in an afternoon, and you got it.
I had to read 2 in high school.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, that probably won't happen anymore.
At my high school, I was the last class to read 1984. And then they still read Fahrenheit 451 for self-defense.
Well, I should hope so. Well, one of the favorite treatments of neo-orthodoxy in Animal Farm is the farm animals behaving as, the peasants and the managers and everything, and the pigs are in charge, and the horses just work harder. And when asked why the pigs get extra food and a roof over their pen, the pigs say to the horses, well, we're all equal, but some of us are more equal than others. And again, so socialism, not recognizing the reality of sin, tends to create these things. But mass media is developed in this period, the early 20th century, starting with radio, moving on to the development of TV shortly after World War II, which was, wow, that was different. Not to mention the later 20th century, we have the Cold War, superpower tensions, possible mutually assured destruction. I don't believe any of you were alive for the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. I was. I remember going with my father downtown and shopping for an atomic bomb shelter that we could dig a hole in our backyard and put it in. We used to do duck and cover drills in elementary school because that would help you in a thermonuclear attack, is to get under your desk and cover your head. Well, you had that going on, which deeply affected the American psyche as well as the cultural Western psyche. Another interesting thing that happened after World War II, you have the collapse of world colonialism. just an implosion as country after country, which had been exploited as a colony, ended up just saying, hey, look, we went to war with you guys, and fought the Germans and the Japanese. We won our freedom. And especially through media, these arguments gained in strength. And indeed they did. And most of those countries that were colonies became independent in that 30 to 40 year window. Well, you also have a digital revolution. I remember finally getting some horrifically prehistoric computer setup going on, I think about 92. It was still kind of catching up with us back then. And now, my gosh, it's ubiquitous. My car has 40 computers in it. And if any one of them goes bad, I have a 2-pound rock. I can't even push it downhill. It won't coast. So I had to take an extra service warranty out on it. But more than that, what this did was this gushed like a sewer pipe into the living rooms of people all over the country. Nothing new. It's the same old stuff that's always been going on. But at least before, we were able to limit it to Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best and, all the fun programs, escapist programs. But now we turn on, and one evening, we're doing a live broadcast from Vietnam in Saigon, and we see this picture of the Saigon police chief is questioning a bunch of Viet Cong suspects, and he just picks one guy up and brains all over everything. Okay, that's not standard entertainment. This is a threshold beyond which communication has changed, awareness has changed. This adds to the disappointment in reason and Enlightenment values. This is one of the hugest things that's happened to us. I mean, you got the global flood, you have the incarnation of Christ and his resurrection, you have the printing press, and you have the digital revolution. Honestly, there might be a couple more you could squeeze in there here and there. But basically, those 4 things stamped the human race in a way that has not been compensated for or recovered from. But the digital revolution changed everything. We've even been talking about how the algorithms are keeping track of us on social media and storing up everything, analyzing us, finding out what we want to buy, what we want to watch. All of that is going on, and here is science combined with industry, and they're supposed to be doing a good job for us. Well, they're not. Anybody remember the Exxon Valdez? The big oil tanker up in Alaska, and the captain at the wheel was just taking a few little extra drinky poos and piled it up on a reef. Well, I think it would take like 4 years to clean up. Killed billions of animals and birds. I'm not sure that the St. Edward Sound is in good shape even today. I think it's still kind of limping along, slowly getting back to a thing. You have, one of my favorites, the Chernobyl Meltdown. Was that 84? I forget. But it was bad. Chernobyl was 86. It's still poison. I think they won't let you live or plant crops within an 80-mile radius of the old Russian reactor that went south. You have the 1984 Bhopal Gas Disaster. This is Union Carbide, a respected chemical company from America, is developing basically nerve gas, among other things, and insecticides in India, because labor's so cheap, right? What's not to love? Well, a valve goes bad and leaks out isocyanate, methyl isocyanate gas, which I believe is an integral ingredient in what does it sound like? What does cyanite sound like? Just 10,000 people are dead. And more die weekly. Maybe they've stopped counting by now. And this was back in the 60s, the thalidomide disaster. Thalidomide was a drug given to pregnant moms, and I forget what it's supposed to do, but it's supposed to be something good for your child. And the children that were born to mothers who were taking thalidomide ended up showing up without arms. Several thousand at least. So, and you know, this is not even like last week where they're testing paratroopers and the atomic bomb, or testing prisoners with sexually transmitted diseases. These are just mistakes. These are just oops. But it's a long line. It goes way past coincidence. What we see are methodologies at work here which are producing bad fruit. And we're losing hope. Sarah, did you have a comment?
What was that last
Thalidomide. Thalidomide, I think. Well, basically this boils down to, that was the first and second half of the 20th century, boils down to an Enlightenment backfire, all these eco-fails. You also have, people were aghast that in all these democratic nations, more or less, democratic nations tended to accelerate the rise of dictators. That was really pretty weird. And they're still trying to puzzle that out. Of course, we can't consider sin as an ingredient, so that's one thing. Human reason has basically failed to resolve anything. As we get towards the end of the 20th century, into the 80s and 90s, after Vietnam, people are really losing, the shine is wearing off of modernism. The idea that reason and science are going to solve anything starts to wane. Now, a lot of people that are still heavily invested are still all behind that, and many, even postmodernists and Christians, still carry a lot of modernist Enlightenment ideas in their heads as part of their worldview. Gosh, you know, we talk about the flood, we talk about the creation, and yet there's a little asterisk on those things often. And did that really happen? What about, you know, the cobalt carbon testing and stuff like that? They're interesting things, but as we saw in several weeks ago, there's a mountain of evidence that has been ignored, bypassed, or buried by the invested parties in the Enlightenment. And we're seeing it still. And they've passed the baton, and now it's become critical race theory. But even so, going back to Soren, we see this early existentialism happening. He's in the mid-1850s, mid-1800s, Danish philosopher, and he is the first guy that really turns away from what he sees on the outside and turns into himself and defines his faith walk and faith experience by what occurs inside him. You know, we were talking before class, he's a fascinating guy. He would hate to see what has been ascribed to his name, but because of this way of looking at life, we call him the father of existentialism. He is never really a happy guy, but at least I believe he did find Christ, and he came to think that all of us needed to embrace the absurdity of life and still press on in order to serve God. He did say, you'll remember from last week or two, that he felt every Christian had to reach a point where they were willing to make Abraham's choice in the offering of Isaac. The willingness to give up anything, even against reason, with the understanding that God is able to restore what was lost. You can make a good argument for that, but I'd hate to have that thrust on me. But we get him. actually helped spur the development of what's called American Transcendentalism. I mean, you got David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Walt Whitman, and later you have Dostoevsky and Kafka come from this line of thinking. The spiritual unity of all forms of being with God, man, and nature, all sharing a universal soul. Really, we're bordering on an organic spiritism here. Pantheism or panentheism, just like we talked about our very first day in class. So the American Transcendentalists don't morph into great things so much, but their commentary on life, both before and around the period of the American Civil War in the mid-1800s, tends to color the discussion rather completely. Eventually, we have Friedrich Nietzsche picking up Kierkegaard's mechanism and ideas and developing his idea of the will to power, the true hero, the Übermensch or the Superman. God is dead, up the Superman. This also spills over into American intelligentsia, where William James and John Dewey define something called pragmatism, which abandons correspondent truth. Truth is no longer what necessarily corresponds to reality. It's much more useful, just as Kierkegaard did a little bit, implied, and Nietzsche actually spoke, that things are true that aid survival. We invent truth when we encounter anomalies or things we can't explain. Knowledge is experiential, truth predicts outcomes, and ethics are consequential. So, the good is justified, the means are justified by the ends. If I get a good consequence, whatever works, that's ethical. So, and these are the brightest guys in America here, figuring this out at the end of the 1800s. Well, about then World War I comes crashing in, the Depression in the 1930s, and back to war we go in the 1940s. So, in an effort to reassert individual importance after the horrific global trauma of what amounts to 50 years of war, global war, there are some French literature professors that come up with some ideas. The first is a guy named Albert Camus. You probably have heard of him. He would not agree with the label existentialist. He would prefer to be labeled an absurdist rather than a nihilist or existentialist. He received the Nobel Literature Prize in 1957 for his story The Stranger, and it is he, in his other work Sisyphus, that said there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living is the fundamental question of philosophy. Any you guys old MASH fans? Yeah, I loved it. I loved it in high school, but they had a song, their theme song, and there was "Suicide is Painless." Very, very existential. Of course, that was in keeping with the 60s and the 70s. Very interesting. Now, what's even more interesting is Albert Camus, for all of his existential, you give life its own meaning, don't be involved with the absurd passions of the human race. He's the guy who actually went to bat supporting the politics of the Algerian revolt in 54 and 62. He had family there. So here's a guy who says one thing, purports one thing in his philosophy, but the minute he needs to emotionally, he bails and goes and helps his family in Algeria. Then we also have Jean-Paul Sartre. At least he smokes a pipe, so you know he's cool. Also a French literature professor. He rejected his childhood upbringing in a Christian home. He's a devotee of Nietzsche and Heidegger, wins the Nobel Literature Prize in 1964, and he refuses it. He also supported the Vietnam protests against the United States, teaching at the University of Paris, I believe. But some unforeseen things happened. Sitting in sitting in his literature class as he expounds these rather elegant metaphorical allegories and such is a young Cambodian student named Pol Pot. And so as Sartre is sharing that terrorism is the handmaid of human progress, violent terrorism is the handmaid of human progress, oh, Pol Pot in the 7th row is listening to this. And Pol Pot thinks, wow, who knew? And he goes back to his home in Cambodia, and in the mid-60s and late 60s, ends up slaughtering 1.5 million of his people in the killing fields in order to cleanse Cambodia and make it a workers' paradise under Marxism. Say again?
How many people?
I believe it's 1.5 million. That will, you'll find different figures. I always kind of shoot for the middle ground if I can. It leaves the most liberal and conservative figures on the edge. Now this is interesting. On his deathbed, Jean-Paul Sartre once again recants and professes Christ. His girlfriend, Simone de Beauvoir, says he was senile by then, and we don't have to worry about the reality of that confession. But apparently both of these guys, because these guys were the shining lights of existentialism, especially French existentialism, apparently neither of them felt that the vehicle upon which they were traveling was fitted for their exit. They thought they needed something else to get them over that last threshold. Well, the story goes on. This is again the 1950s, 1960s. After World War II, you have another interesting thing that happens. This is a group of people who came to be labeled as the Frankfurt School. They're a bunch of German, Jewish intellectuals and philosophers, men and women, who are fleeing Austria as Hitler is coming to power. So this is in the mid-30s. They still have a little window of time to escape what they can see is coming. You know, after Kristallnacht and some of the persecutions that were going on with the Jews, they haven't started herding them into trains and shipping them off to Auschwitz yet, but they can see the writing on the wall. They're saying, well, we got to get out of here. Some escaped through Greece, some through Spain, but there was a whole group of them at the University of Frankfurt that said, okay, on this day, we all buy our tickets and just go. And they did. And they all end up in America. What they do is they combine their philosophical, socio-economic data to produce something they call the social critical theory. They're analyzing, boy, this is Aristotelian to the max. They're analyzing Western culture, both what they see arising in Germany and in the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and the emerging capitalism of the United States. What they do, and they put this down on paper. Okay, there's going to be a quiz next week, so I really need you to commit this. I'm not even going to attempt to, but it's from the Weimar Republic down to the intellectuals who escape and become known as the Frankfurt School, being infiltrated by the Soviet Union through the KGB to create the social science faculties of the universities in the United States, which leads to progressivism, which leads to their influence on traditions, religion, family, nation, property, blah, 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 blah. It's just this hugely cold-blooded semantic blueprint of why we do the things we do and how those things can be influenced and changed. I'd like to say it worked out, but oh, you'll like this. Here's Carl flashing the peace sign. Do you guys remember Clint Eastwood? Okay, and his monkey movies. This is Carl Darwin, one of the monkey movies. We have Pink Floyd over here. Uberman sticks in. I don't know if this is supposed to be Hegel. Yeah, I'm thinking it is too. Joe?
I was wondering, do you put the PowerPoints up on Populi? I want to see that.
Anybody that wants my PowerPoints can have them.
I want to see that, like, the
Okay. As a matter of fact, I have those in my computer. I can put them on a thumb drive and you can load them in. Yeah, he used all these guys. All these guys. And you will hear over and over again, you know, Nietzsche, Darwin, Freud, Marx. Those are the men who basically, their ideas basically run the way our culture moves, the way our culture understands, especially in the intelligentsia and academic circles. That's what's going on right now. Josh?
And I've repeatedly mentioned to you that I've listened to other philosophical teachers from secular, universities, and they paint a very different picture of these and their ideas.
And they must.
It's an interesting contrast
Yeah.
between what I hear from you and then what I'm getting in that mainstream.
Disclaimer here, I get 15 weeks with you guys. 14 this semester, but I'm going to ask you to watch a couple films anyway during spring break, to take what really amounts to several lifetimes of knowledge and do my best to paint a picture for you. But Josh is absolutely right. I'm not trying to make decisions for you. I'm trying to alert you to evidence that exists and stories that are held to by portions of thinkers. You will also find proponents. There are people who love Friedrich Nietzsche. The Nazis couldn't get enough of him. But there are still people who feel he had things to offer us as a culture. I won't even bother to tell you how popular Karl Marx is, especially in the iteration of neo-Marxism. But again, feel free to read these, you guys. Feel free to study. Feel free to research. I'm giving you the shortcut as a cranky old 70-year-old college teacher who belongs to Jesus, that I think this is what you're going to find when you get to the end. You can boil it down as much as you want, but be careful who you read. If you pick fruit off the wrong tree, a really gifted theologian, philosopher, even a secular or an atheist one, can really spin a tale. That's why Paul says, boy, don't be led astray by, the traditional elements of the earth, and the philosophies that you hear. I mean, hold fast to what you know is good, but you have my permission and my blessing to check all of these guys out. I think if you do a good job, you're going to arrive at the conclusions, very close to the conclusions that you're hearing in here. I don't have an axe to grind. I'll be dead before you know it. And it's just, I don't care. I know where I'm going. But you guys might be stuck with 40 or 50 or even 60 years of hard work. I'm just trying to give you a heads up. If you want to study Nietzsche, you want to study Marx, you want to study Darwin, I'd be my guest. But boy, keep your hand on your wallet and your car keys in your pocket, and be ready to book. But yeah, the FBI was the next one to get involved here. Oh no, I have to save them. No, I don't. I can have them right now. Here is the consumer society that actually was birthed during the Great Depression with the extension of credit. Here's an interesting thing. Adolf Hitler was one of the first to begin to use mass media as a vehicle for propaganda. The other person who was able to use it with equal larceny and enthusiasm was FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States. Now, his motives were quite a bit more benign and advocatory for the welfare of the people than Hitler's were, but both of these guys began to create and design advertising, documentaries that fed a particular worldview or a particular agenda, a political agenda. This was brand new. Now, they also were touched by advertising, but that was something that kind of came in on a side note and had more to do with Western media than it did with communist media. I got a report on it if you'd like to look through it at any point. What this did, it really allowed the Frankfurt School to promote their ideas. As they started getting jobs at universities, specifically at Berkeley, their ideas just sounded great. They had some really elegant interpretations of human motives and achievements. The FBI grew rather suspicious as they heard what were sounding like communist ideas, and Frankfurt was, they had elements of Marxism in their thinking. It sounded good to them. For one thing, Jews in the Soviet Union that embraced a Marxist understanding, they ended up getting promoted. They ended up getting treated much better than Jews were used to being treated in any European country, especially in the midst of the upswing to World War II and the horrors that populated that period of time. So there was a lot of Marxist sympathies within the Frankfurt School. The FBI at that time, you remember the McCarthy hearings, it was, whoa, yes, there were a lot of communists, but a lot of them had just dabbled in it, and the McCarthy hearings were a little over the top, a little more like the Spanish Inquisition than anything else. But the FBI basically started tagging these guys and following them, tapping phones, stuff like that, and a lot of them were discredited during the 1950s. Basically, my whole point is the early 20th century, in the uproar of World War, opened up a lot of new avenues for leaders to manipulate their people. Media, advertising, literature, a lot of things that were not normally, didn't enjoy broad exposure, were increasingly getting a higher circulation. Well, there were pessimists among the Frankfurt School that came to America and did the math and said, you know what, I don't think the human race is going to do well. We don't seem to be doing a good job. Max Horkheimer, Theodore Adorno, they returned to Germany and they co-author a book called The Dialectic of Enlightenment, in which they analyze the Enlightenment and say, this wasn't a good thing. This actually hypnotized us into thinking we were doing well, and we ended up entering the most violent century in human history. And our democracies elect losers and psychotic homicidal maniacs. So there's something wrong here. But they go back to the University of Berlin and, never heard from again, really. What we do get are the optimists who stay. We get Herbert Marcuse and Erich Fromm. Now, I don't know if you're aware of these two guys, but I can remember as a senior in high school trying to attend a Herbert Marcuse speech and getting tear gassed at University of California at San Diego. It was an interesting initial exposure to the geopolitical world. What Marcuse did, he wrote, he ends up at Columbia and Berkeley. I think Berkeley for Marcuse and Fromm was at Columbia. But Marcuse ends up writing about, he writes Eros and Civilization. And it's kind of against the ideas of Freud. He says we need to release this Freudian repression. We need to express ourselves sexually. We need to just go after, if it feels good, do it. He said this will liberate not only our sexuality, but us as human beings. He also wrote One-Dimensional Man, a couple years later, a radical critique of industrial society and the consumerist paradigm. You might remember The Organization Man, which depicted just this stand-up suit guy and who gives his soul and body and spirit over to IBM or Xerox or General Motors or whoever. So the birth of the industrial military complex as an idea, and he was not happy with that. He became a leading figure of the New Left by the mid-1960s. He was instrumental in organizing protests over Vietnam. This is the period of time when we saw melded with some of the elements of the civil rights movement, big riots and marches and everything, especially down at Berkeley, but spilling over into Columbia, and pretty soon they were all over the place. You know, Kent State, where several students were shot and killed protesting. They're just, man, the 60s were, that's when the pot was boiling. It was interesting. I'm really glad I wasn't old enough to actually go to college until about 71. So I joined the Army instead. It was better, because it was crazy. I mean, it really was crazy. Classes weren't being held, you know, classes that were being held were held out in the middle of the stadium on the grass. Everybody kind of kicking back, smoking joints, listening to Beatles music. Very, very interesting stuff. Erich Fromm published numerous popular works. I read almost everything by Fromm. He wrote on Marx, on Zen, on Freud, on technology, on aggression, wrote stuff like The Human Ape. And at that time in my life, gosh, it just sounded like such common sense stuff, you know? What's not to love? He became a leading figure not for the political new left, but for the touchy-feely left. He's a guy that wrote about, you know, the Gestalt and not transcendentalism, but meditation, just some of the different means that we can get in touch with ourselves. So he was kind of the intellectual, emotional guy, whereas Marcuse was more the political guy. But together, the outcome, the Frankfurt School invented critical theory, which had the goal of demonizing all traditional institutions such as family, fatherhood, patriotism, Bible-believing churches. It's a fair statement. It's a little mean-spirited, but you could come up with evidence for that. I think this was a conservative think tank that wrote this up. The Frankfurt School published Studies in Prejudice, which taught that anyone who believes in traditional Western Christian culture is prejudiced, a racist or a sexist, a fascist, or is mentally unstable. This is another interesting thing that the left does provide. If you think incorrectly, they like to make the argument, which happened often in Russia, that you're mentally ill. You know, if you're politically conservative, something's wrong with your perceptions and your cognitive thinking processes. So identifying disagreement, ideological disagreement, as mental illness increasingly has become a thing. They've tried it here in the United States a couple times, but too many conservatives, I'm afraid. They tend to shout it down.
Wait, Matt,
Yeah.
but during that time, I mean, there was still slavery, right? There was still...
No. This is by the 1960s, 1970s. Slavery in other countries, sure.
Yeah.
And I'm sure human trafficking. And I'm sure economic exploitation. Yes, all of that. But no legal slavery as such, no sanctioned slavery. Mixing Freud with Marx, they perfected the technique of psychological conditioning. Thus, for example, TV shows, use of mass media, show homosexuals equal normal lifestyle. TV also shows Christians are crazy, intolerant fools. And actually, as a big movie buff, I like to say that as of about 1955, especially after Inherit the Wind, any guys movie buffs, you ever seen Elmer Gantry? Oh, Burt Lancaster, Burt Lancaster does a great job of being kind of a phony evangelist, and he's just in it for the money. And it's really kind of a shock, you know, if you've grown up on the Ten Commandments and Ben-Hur and, you know, the greatest story ever told. It's a real violent wrench to the left in terms of media's treatment of the Christian faith. You know, up until then, oh gosh, The Robe, I can think of a million of the real pro-Christian, and they were really smarmy. They're not very good, but they're what the culture needed back then. But all of a sudden you start seeing this wave of really bitterly critical films portraying Christianity at its worst. As a matter of fact, there are 3 standard iterations of a Christian character in modern media, Hollywood-directed media. One is the selfish, greedy, lying, slimy, philandering church authority, the bishop who molests kids, or Cardinal Richelieu, or somebody like that. There is also the foolish but well-meaning Christian who you like and you get along with him and you forgive him his Christianity, like there it is, Ned Flanders. Ned Flanders. The other guy is Father Mulcahy in MASH, who is very valuable, has a lot of nursing skills, helps in the operating room, and is always there ready to help you with a biblical counseling, and everybody's too busy for him. And no, thank you, Father Mulcahy. So it's interesting. So you can be, an outright hypocritical criminal fool, or at least a criminal, and a fool, a well-meaning fool, or you can be a hypocrite, as Burt Lancaster played in this movie, where you do all the right stuff, say all the right things, but underneath it, you're as crooked as anybody else. You won't find a different Christian character very often. Most of the films that have come out in the last 40 years portrayed that one of those three types of Christians. It's not until the Christian movie-making industry kind of comes into strength do we begin to see things like Risen or, The Passion, things like that. Really interesting stuff. Okay, well that basically brings us to the riots, the shootings, the Black Panthers. Yeah, the 60s were just wow. The early 70s almost as bad. But there was light at the edge of the tunnel. This is probably culturally expired. It's Obama dancing with Sarah Palin, the liberal. You guys didn't know they did this? Yeah, this is a total send-up. They did not do this. I keep using this slide so I can tell when I become socially expired and my cultural references are no longer relevant. Yeah, Dance with the Stars.
Oh, did that actually happen?
No, it did not. Okay, let's get to our favorite topic, deconstruction. Yeah, this is ushering in what we now experience in our culture in a vast array of iterations. Critical race theory, neo-Marxism, literature studies, all the stuff we went through where, you name it, Mark Twain, Laura Ingalls Wilder, Dr. Seuss, the Muppets, it's just insane. It really, it's like, I can't believe I'm hearing this. I'm reading it. Today's newspaper. So, deconstruction. We have a number of people to thank, primarily Jacques Derrida, who was a French literature professor, died in 2004. I don't think we'll be seeing him when we get home. Major philosophical influence. He offers a theory, a critical theory, which I think is important enough for us to take time to go through. It's kind of involved. But I think I've boiled it down to where you guys can, if you stick with me here, I think we can get the thread of the argument. Jacques would say this. He identifies something called logocentrism. Logocentrism basically says all meaning emanates from a logos or a central point of reference. Yeah, bear with me, I'll try to fill it in. Let's take it as it applies to some literature. We'll start, I'm editing out some of the guys because Jacques is the big player. Richard Rorty has a few things to say, but Jacques is the guy I want you to know. Here we have, let's talk about logocentrism. Now, this is not something Jacques is saying we should adopt. This is something he's attacking, as in keeping with postmodernism. Much easier to throw stones than to receive them. So Jacques says this, the logos we will define as a pure and undefiled or originary source. Maybe it's the arche, maybe it's Jesus. It's interesting that he uses that term to define it. But basically, the logos is a central source of value, of power, of relative position, relative meaning. So here's the logos at the center. We've got the logos. Now we have another point, but it's not at the center. It's different than the center. It's farther away from the center. You have the valuable, important, originating source, the logos, at the center. There's no, don't picture this in geometry as much as just recognizing we're emphasizing its importance. But then you also have this second point out here floating around with no relation at all other than it's not logos. Well, it may not be logos, but we can draw a relationship to it between logos and this helpless, worthless, no account dot non-logos that's drifting around out there. Because all of this affects us on an interesting scale. Derrida wants to identify this relationship between these 2 points, the important, valuable logos and the not so important non-logos. This relationship, relationship's a good word. This is called a binary. And it's really defined by the relationship between something good and valuable and something less good and less valuable. Isn't this exciting? Aren't you guys glad you paid so much money and time and energy to come? Okay, this is where it begins to bear some fruit. Logocentrism takes away value by creating binaries. 2 related terms, the first term closer to the logos, and it dominates the second term. And Western philosophy has always been in love with this idea. Platonic forms, right? Platonic forms are our logos, the puzzle box lid. And here's all the little seashells and rocks and sticks and animals that Aristotle collects and takes home to experiment with. But you have the Platonic form is the logos, Aristotle's stuff is the non-logos. That's just one example. All right, you can do this with soul and body. Your soul is the logos, body is the no account less valuable organic meat sack that you drag around with your soul. We talk about vertical and horizontal. And vertical usually entails a qualitative difference in value. Horizontal, not so much, but still horizontal moves away from the logos. Okay, again, let me draw this into something that you can get your teeth into. Let's talk about deconstructing this binary, this relationship. Okay, let's consider, if you will, a text. No center, no logos point can be reliable as a reference because ultimately, based on what we've learned in these last 500 years of philosophy, all meanings are arbitrary. There is no access to real knowledge. So when we select a text and identify a logos, let's use Huck, shall we? You guys have followed the adventures of Huck Finn. Okay, one of Mark Twain's great, which has enjoyed much censure in the last 20 years. But let's use him anyway, as rebellious people that we are. Well, there is Huck, the hero of the story, is this benighted, poor, young, white orphan kid, maybe 14 years old, running around Louisiana, Georgia, paddling up and down the Mississippi River, just, looking for, he's a street kid. He's just looking for a handout or maybe steal a berry pie off of somebody's kitchen window. But there's Huck. And then we also have, in the story, Jim, who sadly Mark Twain labels as Nigger Jim, which is why he's no longer on the shelves of our libraries. So it's the adventures, Huck befriends Jim and Jim befriends Huck, and Jim is a runaway slave. And so now they're kind of on the raft together, going up and down and looking for ways to eat and drink on the Mississippi, and just stay alive. That's all they want to do. They just want to stay alive. And they encounter evil men. They encounter cheaters and grifters and carpetbaggers that try and take advantage of them. But still, their friendship holds together. Now, here's what Jacques Derrida would say. He says, Huck and Jim, when they are captured in text, those words capture them. Those words create a binary between Huck and Jim. And Jim is forever frozen in the literary depiction of marginalized, oppressed, taken advantage of, socially codified. He's forever stuck there. Jim is forever stuck in that book as just a subhuman. Now, here's the problem from my point of view. If you read Huck Finn, you discover Jim is actually the hero. He is smarter, has moral integrity, actually rescues Huck from the bad guys more than once, saves him when they're run over by a paddle wheel steamer in the middle of the night. Jim is the hero. And that's Mark Twain's purpose in describing him, in using him in the narrative, is to show the unfairness of his depiction in society as Nigger Jim. He's saying, this is evil. What we're doing is evil. It's just like Laura Ingalls Wilder. But because the word nigger appears, all the high school librarians in America have pulled Huck Finn from the shelves. Because of the binary. See, when the librarians went to school 30 years ago, this was the hot topic. It's still the hot topic. This has contaminated all literary criticism and literary studies in the academic campuses of America, and in truth, Western civilization to this point. So what we have to do is break the binary. One, we have to burn every copy of Mark Twain's Huck Finn that we can find, and by implication, all text. All text. Because look how often I use the arbitrary binaries to show that the Multnomah Human Resources Department is drinking something really bad for them, in order to endorse Klingon as a legitimate language. I'm politically oppressing them, and by using the text to make that example, I'm freezing people in oppression. I have arbitrarily chosen to persecute the Multnomah Department of Human Resources for no good reason other than that I don't value the Klingon language. It's so hard to contain myself sometimes. Okay, so we need to get rid of the binary, right? Because it's so unfair. No matter where it appears in text, no matter what two characters, no matter what relationship, this could be Jesus and Simon Magus. And yet still, we have no moral right or ethical need to justify a binary connecting those two forever and holding poor old Simon in a responsible position. or in an oppressed position. Well, what we need to do, we need not only to free Jim by getting rid of the text and allowing him to float freely in the universe with any understanding we want to put there. We also need to free Huck, because he's stuck, in the imperialistic, colonial, patriarchal, blah, 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 blah. And we need to free Huck and free Jim. We need to free every character who is immortalized in literature. You ever read a book that made you cry, that made you feel good, that actually taught you something about being a human being? You poor fools. You didn't really. You were manipulated by the text, the oppression involved, the arbitrary meanings available to you. Oh my gosh, I just want to take a baseball bat some days, but I'm not going to do that. It's not a good example. Deconstruction allows everything, every element formerly imprisoned in text to be released from the text and float in a state called aporia. I know this was a very weird idea, but do you have the basics of the binary relationship? Do you understand what Jacques Derrida is saying, as wacko as it is? Yes, Kelly?
Is this where they're coming from with the whole math thing?
Absolutely. Because a right answer and a wrong answer. Right answer, logos. Wrong answer, Jim. So we need to break the binary. Let me share something with you. This was shared by Diane Schneider of the National Education Association addressing the UN Commission on the Status of Women in New York in 2011. Oral sex, masturbation, and orgasms need to be taught in education. Such comprehensive sex education is the only way to combat heterosexism and gender conformity. Gender identity expression and sexual orientation are a spectrum, and those who are opposed to homosexuality are stuck in a binary box that religion and family create. You should, if you read through that critical race theory on mathematics, you will encounter the term binary, I think, at least twice, maybe 3 times. But this, any distinction, any discrimination on your part, even though if you read the dictionary, discrimination is not a bad thing. Have I shared with you the 2 bowls of breakfast bowls? Okay, if I filled one little breakfast bowl with Captain Crunch, and I filled the other little breakfast bowl by following my dog around the backyard for an hour, and I gave them to you and told you to choose one, how would you choose one without discriminating? So, okay, I can just give you this one, right? You don't want it. Are you discriminating? Yeah, heck yeah. Words have meanings, and those meanings are often attacked and changed. Jehovah's Witnesses do it a lot. I can remember a time when gay actually meant happy, carefree, joyful. Doesn't mean that anymore. But I'm really ticked off they stole our rainbow. I think they're going to pay for that. But there are so many words, and some are in fun. Gosh, our youngsters now, to say something is good, we used to say it was cool or bitchin'. Now we say it's sick. Okay, that's all right. I'm good with that. That's to create a language in which I can really define the boundaries of my little community and peer group, and it's okay. It feels good. And as soon as the grown-ups get hip to that, then it's no good anymore. So. And it's only the beginning, Joe. Golly. Well, basically, guys, the binary thing is a true thing. And our culture, and especially anything coming out of the philosophical or even larger, the academic world, the intelligentsia world right now, whether it knows it or not, is infected with these intellectual bacteria. Is it possible there's good things in postmodern thinking? I think so. One is it really addressed a lot of the horrible things that we saw. I don't know, have you guys ever seen an old Tarzan movie? Okay, it's basically, you know, the rich professor goes to Africa and he hires a bunch of native guys to be his carriers of his equipment, scientific equipment and stuff. And they have to go up this narrow winding trail, climb the mountain to the hidden plateau where the dinosaurs live. And sure enough, you know, one or two of the native bearers, who've been walking on these trails all their life, by the way, and surviving the jungle, they fall and stumble and go screaming down the cliffs. And when they have to communicate with the professor, they are portrayed in such a painfully, I hardly know what to call it. It's as if they were apes. And it's horrible to watch. And even worse, the professor's daughter came along. And, you know, she's this ditzy blonde, you know, with 2 college degrees helping dad out. But she gets separated from the safari troop, you know, and suddenly she's out in the deep grass, sees the leopard or the lion eyeballing her, and decides to escape, but falls. Oh! And your overwhelming thought is, oh, just eat her. Just do it, dude. And it's horrible. If I were a woman, I'd be so mad watching that. You know, I served with women paratroopers and special forces, and they're the real deal, guys. Women can do that. But there's a price tag for a woman that goes head to head with the guys in that milieu and succeeds. Yeah, I think she does lose some femininity. At least the things that we have traditionally valued women for. But you know what? If that's what they want to do, we just had 2, I think, young women captains that graduated Ranger training. And if you ever watch the Demi Moore picture, G.I. Jane, she shaves her, you know, the first week at SEAL training, she just, I don't know, she keeps encountering, they give her little steps to get over the obstacle course wall, and they have a separate bathroom for her. And after a week, she gets so frustrated that she just gets rid of that, shaves her head, grabs her mattress, moves in with the guys, and it's just toe to toe. That's how it has to be if women go to war. And it's because there's no gender norming in war. I mean, the guys get killed too. Now, we're given everything we know how to do. So it's just understand that, because that's the part that won't be explained to you by our academic circles. You know, they're just saying, oh, you're being oppressed by the patriarchal thing. No, not really. There's more to it. Again, like we've said before, I'd love for you to get into the habit when you encounter a new idea, especially if it's one that interests you and tickles you, ask yourself first, why do I find this attractive? What's my motivation? Having done that, ask, what's their motivation? Why am I receiving this new idea? Why is this being pitched to me? And then 3, what would it take for this to be true? How much of this is sizzle and how much of this is steak? You don't want to pay for a 12-pound steak and get 1 pound steak, 11 ounces of sizzle. But that's how sales are. That's how political agendas are formed. So just, gosh, as you go through the challenges that you're going to go through, I sift the things that you encounter. My favorite verse, or one of my favorites, 1 Thessalonians 5:21, Paul tells the Thessalonians, examine everything. You live in a huge sandbox. You have carte blanche. You can go where you want, read what you want, do what you want. But in the end, don't hold on to anything except what's good. Hold on to what's good. And you'll know. If you're interested in finding the truth, just like all the people that we'll be sharing evidential apologetics with in the years to come, somebody that wants the truth will hear you. They will hear you. And that's the person to share with. Well, you know, there's Richard Rorty here. I don't even know if he's worth going into, but we could look real quickly. He's not as important as Derrida. Richard Rorty says, Western philosophers have imposed themselves as Olympian mediators, pursuing a God's eye view of reality. This really hampers free play. I don't know what else we're supposed to do as we're trying to comment on the representational distillation of 7 billion people, and we're trying to just think about it. But it does hamper free play because it often depends on a binary, like good and evil, or righteousness and unrighteousness, or the common and the holy. And these are just inevitable things if you're interested in the truth. Well, Richard Rorty, I don't know that he's that interested in the truth. He would say that truth is a statement that works for us, that causes what we desire, which would be great if we desired the right things. But as my friend Rick Boya says, we have broken pickers. We don't. And being happily engaged in the 33rd year of my happy second marriage, I can tell you very well that counting on my own wisdom to choose did not work out for me. And that helped bring me to Christ, so any price is enough for that. But be careful. Be careful of what you ask for. Be careful of what you choose. See, I'm preaching on every point in the outline now. It's really bad. It's getting bad. Truth denotes a statement that works for us. Language is causal, not representational. Rorty would say this, the solution to social problems is pragmatic discourse. That sounds okay. Practical dialogue, that sounds okay. He would say that a true hero is the strong poet who guides the dialogue into new areas. Just for fun, we got like 2 minutes to waste. Who would like to define their understanding of dialogue? Just for fun. What is dialogue? Yeah. I break that down kind of into the elements, Kel. What, if you were going to describe that more scientifically or empirically, what? Like two human beings sharing ideas. Okay, their opinions. Anybody want to add to that? Joe?
I would add that like dialogue and discourse is searching for the truth. It's two people with sometimes agreeing positions, sometimes opposing positions, searching for the truth.
Okay, and you know what? I would agree with both of you.
That's maybe not what the public thinks, but that's more of like the ancient Greek.
My undergraduate degree was in communications and management. And I was shocked to learn that the way dialogue is defined now, because that's what I would have said. Well, it's two people talking together, trying to find the answer, the right, what works, what's the solution, what's the truth. And the actual go-to politically correct definition, even at a Christian college, is that dialogue is two people exchanging ideas until they can find a point of agreement in harmony. So if you're talking with the Molech worshiper, who really just wants to, sacrifice your child to Molech, that's all they want, you are not engaging in honest dialogue and relational give and take until you find a point of agreement with the Molech worshiper. which seems sad to me. But then if you've got 3 kids, you know, donating one for good neighborly relations, how can that be bad? Yeah, Joe.
So this is like a working definition, and it may be taught like within schools, but like I'm glad that we still have like philosophers and thinkers. I was just watching a debate between Jordan Peterson and Zizek about Marxism and capitalism, and they were not agreeing, and in the start of the debate, they were saying like, this is about like finding answers, like this, we care about the truth. So I think are they anomalies now in today's culture?
Let's just say they're on thin ice. If a guy had a really strong reputation for pressing the progressive agenda, I think he'd be forgiven for stating it in that way, because he understands it in that way. But if it were you and me, we would be held accountable for that. And we're finding that increasingly as we participate in community dialogues. It's getting harder and harder for our correspondents listening to us to even keep their mouths shut until we've stated our thing. I don't even participate in the inter-college discussions anymore because they're just so carried away. But it's increasingly hard to do that. I was shocked when I learned that you have to let go of any anchors you have in order to dialogue effectively with another human being. And to be honest, I'm just not willing to go there. But that's okay, because I'm not going to be here for a huge long time remaining. You guys, I'm sad to say, will be here for quite a while. Kelly, you had your hand up.
Well, it made me think of Jesus talking to the Pharisees.
Well, there's going to be a point of demarcation, and you know what? At the point of death, that demarcation becomes permanent, which is why we want to engage as many people as we can. And it's hard, but the dessert is you guys have survived the worst I had to offer. We've come from classical dualism to postmodern deconstruction. More than anything, you've been witness to the trajectory of human thinking without God, and it just has increasingly indulged our innate, selfish, carnal, broken, fallen selves, in spite of a lot of good efforts by a lot of well-meaning people. It's where the planet is headed. I don't mean to discourage you, but I do want you to kind of sharpen your pencils and your brains and be ready for this thing that comes out of the blue, because it's going to morph. I'll simply close on Richard Rorty to say that he says solidarity is the social glue that holds society together. That's why a dialogue needs to produce agreement, no matter what. So we can all share together in the sense of community. You guys, you recognize the Borg, right? Okay. Sometimes I wonder, are they asleep? Are they listening? This is what the progressive agenda is visualizing for us. In their minds, it looks a lot better and feels a lot better, but ultimately it's not. Solidarity expands as we embrace our identification with others, no matter their feelings or positions on anything. We should embrace everybody without discrimination. Cruelty and humiliation are the worst crimes, which is why the progressive agenda specializes in harassing cruelly and humiliating Christians. I'm going to go out on a limb in the last 60 seconds and say I think this is coming quickly. I think in this coming decade, especially as a result of the political turmoils we've undergone, we're just going to see an edge come on this. I mean, if they're yelling at the Muppets and Laura Ingalls Wilder, it's not going to be a long time before they try to take our book away. Just be ready, guys, and don't worry, we win. I snuck a peek at the last page, and the Lord totally kicks booty. So.
Well, it might not be actually taking the Bible away, but they're already watering it down. It's already being taken away.
Yeah. where they change, although that blew up on NIV. And that really backfired in their face when NIV tried to do that. So I don't know. It is up to us to witness to our desire, to hold on to the fidelity of God's Word. And because there will always be faithful reproductions of the Bible as long as there are faithful believers. We're the ones that keep that intact. And especially you guys. You're here at college making that happen. So, oh gosh, we're right on the minute. Let's just say a blessing of goodbye. And Father, what weirdness we have to delve into. Please help our minds to be clean. Help us to get a tetanus shot after reading all this stuff. And just, Lord, remain true to what we know is right and good. And not to hate the people that are saying these things, but to pray for them as deluded sinners, Father, just completely taken over by the deception, by the philosophies and elements of this world. Please help us to have some labor and bear some fruit in freeing some of these people to receive and hear your gospel and to give their lives to your Son. Without you, Lord, and the inhabitation of your Spirit, I don't believe any of us would have any hope of doing so. But your promises indicate that if we move in the right direction and trust you, it will happen. And that's what we ask. In Jesus' name. Amen.